The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of the royal palace, as Captain Marcus Chen adjusted his crisp military uniform one final time. His boots clicked against the polished stone as he walked through the ornate gates, past the towering columns that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies and political intrigue. Today would be different from any other day in his distinguished military career. Marcus had spent 15 years climbing the ranks of the elite Special Forces Division, earning medals and commendations that filled an entire wall of his modest apartment. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Soldiers whispered about his legendary precision during covert operations, his ability to remain calm under the most intense pressure, and his unwavering dedication to duty. But none of that mattered today. Today, he was simply another visitor requesting an audience with the palace administration. The massive wooden doors of the palace reception hall seemed to dwarf even his 6-foot frame as he approached the reception desk. Behind the polished marble counter sat a stern-looking woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes sharp and calculating. She looked up from her paperwork with the practiced indifference of someone who had dealt with countless petitioners over the years. "I need to speak with someone in authority about the Royal Guard selection process," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of determination that made the receptionist pause in her routine dismissal. She glanced at his military insignia, noting the Special Forces badge and the row of service ribbons across his chest. "The Royal Guard positions are filled through a very specific protocol, Captain. Applications are reviewed by a committee, and candidates must meet extremely rigorous standards." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped behind his back in a military stance that conveyed both respect and resolve. "I understand the standards, ma'am. I've reviewed them extensively. What I don't understand is why qualified candidates are being overlooked, while less experienced individuals are being fast-tracked through the selection process." The receptionist's pen stopped moving across her paperwork. In all her years at the palace, she had rarely encountered someone who spoke so directly about such sensitive matters. Most visitors came seeking favors, appointments, or ceremonial positions. This man was different. He wasn't asking for anything, he was questioning the system itself. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, Captain," she replied, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly well. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder containing documentation he had carefully compiled over the past several months. 3 months ago, Lieutenant Bradley Harrison was selected for the Royal Guard despite having only basic training and no combat experience. 2 weeks later, Sergeant David Mills received the same appointment. Both men have family connections to current palace staff. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Other visitors in the reception hall had stopped their conversations and were openly listening to the exchange. Palace staff members who had been moving through the hall with practiced efficiency now slowed their pace, clearly interested in this unusual confrontation. Meanwhile, Marcus continued, "Decorated veterans with exemplary service records have been rejected without explanation. Officers who have served their country with distinction, who have proven themselves under fire, who have dedicated their lives to protecting others, these men are being passed over for positions they are supremely qualified to hold." The receptionist set down her pen entirely and studied Marcus with new attention. "Captain Chen, the Royal Guard selection process has been in place for decades. It involves considerations beyond military experience, diplomatic skills, ceremonial training, personal conduct reviews. I'm not questioning the need for comprehensive evaluation," Marcus replied, his voice remaining calm despite the growing tension in the room. "I'm questioning whether that evaluation is being conducted fairly and transparently. When family connections and personal favors carry more weight than merit and service, the integrity of the entire institution is compromised." Word of the confrontation was already spreading through the palace corridors. Staff members whispered among themselves as they passed, and several guards had positioned themselves where they could observe the interaction without appearing to eavesdrop. The atmosphere in the reception hall had shifted from routine bureaucratic business to something far more charged. The receptionist glanced toward a door marked "Administration," and then back at Marcus. "Captain, these are very serious allegations. If you wish to file a formal complaint, there are procedures that must be followed." "I'm not here to file complaints through back channels and bureaucratic maze," Marcus said, his military bearing unwavering. I'm here to address this issue directly with whoever has the authority to ensure fair treatment for all qualified candidates. The Royal Guard represents the highest level of service to the Crown. That position should be earned through merit, not inherited through connections. The conversation had reached a point where it could no longer be contained within the normal boundaries of palace protocol. The receptionist realized that this was not a situation she could handle with standard procedures and polite deflection. This officer was prepared to take his challenge to whatever level necessary to ensure his concerns were addressed. As Marcus stood waiting for her response, the weight of his decision settled around him. He knew that challenging the established order of royal appointments could have serious consequences for his military career. But his sense of duty and justice had brought him to this moment, and he was prepared to see it through regardless of the personal cost. The administrative door opened with a soft click, and a tall man in an expensive suit emerged from the inner offices. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his movements carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations. This was Director William Ashford, the palace's chief administrative officer, a man whose influence extended far beyond his official title. "Captain Chen," Director Ashford said, extending his hand with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand you have some concerns about our selection procedures." Marcus shook the offered hand firmly, maintaining eye contact as he had been trained to do during high-stakes negotiations. "Director Ashford, thank you for seeing me. Yes, I have serious concerns about the fairness and transparency of the Royal Guard selection process. Please, let's discuss this in my office where we can speak more privately," Ashford replied, gesturing toward the administrative wing. As they walked, Marcus noticed how other staff members averted their gazes and busied themselves with sudden urgent tasks. The political sensitivities surrounding this conversation were already becoming apparent. Ashford's office was a study in understated power. Mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and portraits of former palace administrators lined the walls. The director settled behind his impressive desk while Marcus remained standing, a subtle but deliberate choice that maintained his military bearing and suggested he was not seeking favors. "Captain, I've reviewed your service record," Ashford began, opening a file that had clearly been prepared quickly after the confrontation in the reception hall. "Your achievements are indeed impressive. However, the Royal Guard position requires a very specific set of qualifications that extend beyond military excellence." Marcus had anticipated this line of reasoning. "With respect, sir, I've studied the official requirements extensively. Combat experience, leadership capabilities, diplomatic skills, physical fitness standards, security clearance, and character evaluation. I meet or exceed every published criterion." Ashford leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered his response. The selection process also involves intangible factors: the ability to integrate with existing team dynamics, understanding of palace protocol, family stability that ensures long-term commitment. Are you suggesting that Lieutenant Harrison and Sergeant Mills possess these intangible qualities that veteran officers lacked? Marcus asked, his tone remaining respectful but pointed. Or are you acknowledging that other factors influence their selection? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both men understood perfectly. Ashford had spent his career navigating such delicate conversations, but he rarely encountered someone who approached them with such direct precision. "Captain Chen, the palace operates within a complex ecosystem of relationships and traditions. Sometimes decisions that appear questionable from the outside serve broader institutional purposes." Marcus moved closer to the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "Director, with respect, that sounds like an admission that merit is not the primary consideration in these selections. The Royal Guard position carries tremendous responsibility, protecting members of the royal family, maintaining security protocols, representing the monarchy at official functions. These responsibilities require the highest level of competence and integrity." Ashford stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, clearly buying time to formulate his response. "You're putting me in a difficult position, Captain. The selection process has been approved at the highest levels of palace administration. Then perhaps those highest levels need to be made aware of how their approved process is actually being implemented." Marcus replied without hesitation. "I'm not seeking personal advancement, Director. I'm seeking accountability for a system that should represent the best of what our military and our monarchy stand for." The director turned from the window, his expression more serious now. "Captain, are you prepared for the consequences of pursuing this matter further? Challenging established procedures at this level can have far-reaching implications for your career." Marcus had expected this warning, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent a chill down his spine. His military pension, his reputation, his future prospects, all of it could be jeopardized by continuing down this path. But the faces of qualified officers who had been passed over flashed through his mind, along with the knowledge that remaining silent would only perpetuate an unjust system. "I understand the risks, sir, but I also understand my duty as an officer and as a citizen. When systems designed to promote excellence instead reward connections and favoritism, someone must be willing to speak up." Ashford returned to his desk and made several notes in Marcus's file. "Very well, Captain. I'll need to consult with my superiors about how to proceed with your concerns. This will require careful consideration at multiple levels of palace administration." "How long will this process take?" Marcus asked. "These matters cannot be rushed. There are protocols to follow, people to consult, precedents to consider. I would estimate several weeks at minimum." Marcus recognized the classic bureaucratic strategy of delay and obfuscation, but he also understood that he had pushed the conversation as far as it could go at this level. "I appreciate your willingness to address these concerns, Director. I hope the review will be thorough and objective." As Marcus prepared to leave, Ashford delivered one final message. "Captain, I strongly advise you to avoid discussing this matter with media or other external parties while the review is ongoing. Such discussions could complicate the process significantly." Walking back through the palace corridors, Marcus felt the weight of eyes upon him. Word of his challenge had clearly spread throughout the administrative staff, and everyone seemed to be evaluating him with new interest. Some expressions showed admiration for his courage, while others conveyed concern about the potential consequences of his actions. He had crossed a line from which there was no easy retreat, but he felt no regret about his decision to speak up for what he believed was right. 3 days after his meeting with Director Ashford, Marcus received an unexpected phone call at his military base. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to someone who clearly operated at high levels of government administration. "Captain Chen, this is Colonel Patricia Reynolds from Royal Personnel Services. We need to meet immediately regarding your recent inquiry at the palace." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Royal Personnel Services was a department most military officers only heard about in whispered conversations. They handled sensitive personnel matters that crossed between military and royal administration. A summons from Colonel Reynolds was not something to be taken lightly. "Of course, Colonel. When and where would you like to meet?" "This afternoon, 2 o'clock, at the Royal Military Club downtown. Come alone and Captain. This conversation is strictly confidential." The Royal Military Club occupied a stately building in the heart of the capital, its brass nameplate weathered by decades of political storms and changing administrations. Marcus had been there only once before, for a ceremony honoring decorated veterans. Today, the familiar surroundings felt charged with tension and possibility. Colonel Reynolds was waiting in a private dining room, her uniform impeccable, and her silver hair styled in a precise military cut. She was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps in her early 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around her with tactical precision. "Captain Chen, please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her at a small table. "I'll get straight to the point. Your meeting with Director Ashford has created quite a stir in certain circles." Marcus maintained his composure, though his mind raced with possibilities about what certain circles might mean. "Colonel, I simply raised legitimate concerns about fairness in the selection process, and those concerns have been noted at levels far higher than you might have anticipated," Reynolds replied, opening a folder that contained documents Marcus couldn't quite read from his position. "What you may not realize is that your observations align with intelligence we've been gathering for several months." This was not what Marcus had expected to hear. "Intelligence, Colonel?" Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Captain, the Royal Guard appointment irregularities you identified are part of a much larger pattern we've been investigating. Your documentation and direct challenge have provided us with additional confirmation of systemic issues within palace administration." Marcus felt a mixture of validation and apprehension. His individual act of conscience had apparently connected with a broader investigation he knew nothing about. What kind of systemic issues are we talking about? Appointments, contracts, policy decisions, a network of influence that extends well beyond Royal Guard selections. Your Lieutenant Harrison and Sergeant Mills are small pieces in a much larger puzzle involving family connections, financial considerations, and political favors. The colonel pulled several photographs from her folder and placed them on the table. Marcus recognized some of the faces, palace staff members he had seen during his visit, along with others he didn't know. We believe Director Ashford has been operating what amounts to a patronage system within palace administration for at least 3 years. Positions are sold, favors are traded, and qualified candidates are systematically excluded to make room for those with the right connections or the ability to pay. Marcus stared at the photographs, trying to process the implications. Colonel, are you saying my complaint has uncovered evidence of corruption at the highest levels of palace administration? Your complaint provided the final piece of documentation we needed to move forward with a comprehensive investigation. Captain, we've been watching this situation develop for months, but we needed someone with unquestionable integrity to make the formal challenge that would justify our intervention. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. You were waiting for someone like me to come forward, Reynolds nodded. We needed a legitimate complainant with impeccable credentials and pure motives. Someone who could not be dismissed as a disgruntled job seeker or politically motivated troublemaker. Your service record and the way you handled your challenge made you exactly the catalyst we required. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what he had unknowingly become involved in. What happens now? Now, Captain, you have a choice to make. You can walk away from this situation and return to your regular duties, knowing that others will handle the investigation. Or you can help us complete this operation and ensure that real reform takes place. The colonel's words carried weight far beyond their surface meaning. Marcus understood that he was being offered the opportunity to become part of something much larger than his original complaint about Royal Guard appointments. What would helping you involve? We need you to maintain contact with palace administration, to continue pressing your case through normal channels while we gather final evidence. Your ongoing involvement provides us with legitimate access to conversations and documents that would otherwise be difficult to obtain. Marcus considered the implications carefully. This was no longer simply about fairness in military appointments. It had evolved into an investigation of government corruption at the highest levels. Colonel, I need to understand something. Is this operation sanctioned at the highest levels of government? Reynolds met his gaze directly. Captain, this investigation has approval from sources that I am not authorized to name, but which you can trust represent the ultimate authority in matters of royal administration integrity. The weight of the moment settled around them. Marcus realized that his simple desire to ensure fair treatment for qualified officers had connected him to a much more significant effort to clean up systemic corruption within the palace administration. What guarantees do I have about my own protection and career security? Full protection, Captain. Your service record will be enhanced, not damaged, by your cooperation with this investigation. You will be recognized as someone who stood up for integrity when it mattered most. Marcus looked again at the photographs on the table, representing a network of corruption that extended far beyond anything he had imagined when he first walked into the palace reception hall. Colonel, I'm prepared to help in whatever way is necessary to ensure this system is reformed. 2 weeks into his covert cooperation with Colonel Reynolds, Marcus found himself back in Director Ashford's office. But this time the dynamic had completely changed. Hidden beneath his uniform jacket was a small recording device, and his previous nervousness had been replaced by a steely determination to gather the evidence needed to expose the corruption. Captain Chen, thank you for coming in, Ashford said, though his usual polished demeanor seemed strained. I have some updates regarding your concerns about the Royal Guard selection process. Marcus took his seat across from the director's desk, noting how Ashford's hands fidgeted with papers and how his eyes didn't maintain their usual direct contact. Something had changed in the palace administration since their last meeting. I appreciate you following up, Director. Have you been able to review the selection criteria and procedures? Ashford cleared his throat and opened a different file than the one he had consulted during their previous conversation. Yes, well, we've conducted a preliminary review, and I want to assure you that all selections have followed proper protocols. Marcus leaned forward slightly, adopting the posture of someone genuinely seeking information rather than challenging authority. Could you walk me through how Lieutenant Harrison and Sergeant Mills were evaluated against the official criteria? The director's discomfort became more apparent as he shuffled through his papers. Well, both candidates demonstrated the necessary qualifications during their evaluation process. Harrison, for example, showed exceptional attention to detail during his ceremonial training assessment. I'm curious about his combat experience evaluation, Marcus pressed gently. The official requirements state that Royal Guard candidates should have demonstrated leadership under pressure in operational environments. Ashford's pause lasted several seconds too long. Combat experience can be demonstrated in various ways, Captain. Training exercises, simulation scenarios, theoretical knowledge of tactical situations. Marcus made a note in his small notebook, knowing that every word was being recorded. So Harrison's combat experience came from training rather than actual field operations? The evaluation committee determined that his overall profile met our requirements, Ashford replied, clearly trying to avoid specific details. What about the background investigation process? Marcus continued. I understand that Royal Guard candidates undergo extensive security clearance reviews, including financial history and family connections. Director Ashford stood up from his desk and walked to his window, a gesture Marcus now recognized as a stalling tactic. All candidates receive thorough background investigations. Of course, Director, I hope you'll forgive my directness. But I've learned that both Harrison and Mills have family members currently employed in palace administration. Wouldn't that create potential conflicts of interest that should be disclosed during the selection process? The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Ashford turned from the window, his face noticeably pale. Captain, where exactly are you getting this information? Marcus maintained his calm expression while his heart raced. This was the moment Colonel Reynolds had prepared him for, when his questions would push Ashford beyond standard evasions into more dangerous territory. Director, this information is available through standard military personnel databases. I'm simply trying to understand how the evaluation committee weighed these family connections against the principle of merit-based selection. Ashford returned to his desk but remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. Captain Chen, I'm beginning to wonder about the true purpose of your inquiry. Are you working with outside parties to gather information about palace administration procedures? The accusation hung between them like an electric charge. Marcus realized that Ashford suspected something but wasn't sure exactly what. This was the critical moment that would determine whether his covert operation could continue. Director, I'm a military officer concerned about fairness in a selection process that affects the careers of many qualified soldiers. If my questions seem thorough, it's because I believe the Royal Guard position deserves the highest standards of integrity. Ashford sat down heavily in his chair. Captain, let me be completely frank with you. The Royal Guard selection process involves considerations that extend beyond the published criteria: political stability, family loyalty, long-term institutional relationships. These factors have always played a role in palace appointments. Marcus felt a surge of excitement. Ashford was essentially admitting to the corruption, probably hoping that acknowledging it indirectly would end Marcus's investigation. Are you saying that family connections and political considerations officially override merit-based qualifications? I'm saying that the palace operates within a complex environment where multiple factors must be balanced. Sometimes the most qualified candidate on paper is not the best choice for the institution's long-term interests. Marcus made another note, ensuring the recording device captured this crucial admission. Could you give me a specific example of how these broader considerations affected recent selections? Ashford's face showed clear signs of internal struggle. He had already said more than he intended, but Marcus's persistent questioning was drawing him deeper into admissions he couldn't easily retract. Captain, in Harrison's case, his family has served the palace faithfully for 2 generations. That kind of institutional loyalty provides security guarantees that cannot be quantified through standard evaluation metrics. And what about candidates whose families have served the military faithfully for generations? Marcus asked. Doesn't that institutional loyalty deserve equal consideration? The director's composure finally cracked. Captain Chen, You're asking me to defend decisions that are made at levels far above my authority. The appointment process involves consultations with senior palace officials, political advisors, and sometimes external stakeholders who have legitimate interests in staffing decisions. Marcus realized that Ashford had just admitted to the existence of the broader corruption network that Colonel Reynolds had described. External stakeholders with interests in palace staffing could only mean people who were paying for appointments or trading favors for positions. Director, are you telling me that external parties influence Royal Guard appointments? People outside the official chain of command have input into military personnel decisions? Ashford's face showed the full realization of how far his admissions had gone. Captain, this conversation has moved well beyond your original concerns about selection fairness. I think we should conclude our discussion here. But Marcus pressed forward with one final question. Director, if external stakeholders are influencing these appointments, don't you think the public and the military have a right to know about these arrangements? The meeting ended with Director Ashford's refusal to answer, but Marcus had accomplished exactly what Colonel Reynolds had hoped for. The recording device had captured admissions of corruption that would provide the evidence needed for the broader investigation to move forward. The morning after his explosive meeting with Director Ashford, Marcus arrived at his military base to find an official summons waiting on his desk. The royal seal at the top of the document made his stomach tighten. He was being called to appear before the Palace Administrative Review Board within 48 hours, Colonel. Reynolds had warned him that his investigation might trigger a defensive response from the Palace administration, but seeing the official summons made the danger feel suddenly very real. The Administrative Review Board had the power to recommend disciplinary action against military personnel who interfered with royal operations. Marcus immediately contacted Colonel Reynolds, who arranged to meet him at a secure location that evening. The safe house was an unremarkable apartment building in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where serious government business was conducted away from prying eyes and electronic surveillance. They're trying to intimidate you, Reynolds explained as soon as Marcus arrived. The Administrative Review Board is Ashford's attempt to shut down your investigation before it can proceed further. Marcus paced the small living room, his military training warring with natural human anxiety about his career and future. Colonel, what exactly am I walking into? Can they actually court-martial me for asking questions about selection procedures? Reynolds opened her briefcase and withdrew several thick folders. Technically, yes. They can claim you exceeded your authority, interfered with royal administration, or violated protocols regarding civilian-military relations. But, Captain, we're not going to let that happen. She spread documents across the coffee table, recordings, photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption within the palace administration. Your recordings from yesterday's meeting with Ashford were exactly what we needed. His admissions about external stakeholders and political considerations provide direct evidence of the conspiracy we've been tracking. Marcus examined the documents, seeing his individual complaint transformed into part of a massive investigation involving dozens of appointments, contracts, and policy decisions spanning several years. How does this help me survive the review board hearing? Colonel Reynolds smiled for the first time since Marcus had known her. Because, Captain, the review board hearing is going to be very different from what Director Ashford expects. We've been in communication with the highest levels of royal administration, and certain parties are very interested in cleaning house. She pulled out a letter bearing the official seal of the Royal Private Secretary's office. This morning, the Royal Private Secretary received a comprehensive briefing about the corruption investigation. The response was immediate and decisive. Marcus read the letter, his eyes widening as he absorbed its contents. The Royal Private Secretary was ordering a complete suspension of the Administrative Review Board proceedings, pending a thorough investigation of palace personnel practices. The palace is going to investigate itself? Not exactly, Reynolds replied. The investigation is being conducted by an independent commission with full authority to review all personnel decisions, financial arrangements, and administrative procedures from the past 5 years. Your complaint triggered the justification they needed to launch this comprehensive review. The implications began to sink in. Marcus's individual act of courage had provided the catalyst for a complete overhaul of palace administration procedures. What happens to people like Director Ashford during this investigation? Ashford has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. Several other senior palace officials have been suspended as well. The commission has broad authority to recommend personnel changes, policy reforms, and even criminal prosecutions if they find evidence of illegal activity. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. The corruption he had suspected was being addressed at the highest levels, but he understood that powerful people were now facing serious consequences because of his actions. Colonel, am I going to be safe through this process? People like Ashford have connections and resources that could make my life very difficult. Reynolds closed her briefcase and looked directly at Marcus. Captain, you need to understand something. This investigation has support at levels that make Director Ashford's connections irrelevant. The royal family takes corruption within their administration very seriously, and they are prepared to support anyone who helps expose and eliminate it. She handed him another document, a letter of commendation signed by the highest military authorities, recognizing his integrity and courage in bringing important issues to light. Your career is not only safe, Captain, it's been enhanced by your actions. The military needs officers who are willing to speak up when they see injustice, regardless of personal risk. Marcus read the commendation, feeling a profound sense of relief mixed with pride. His decision to challenge the system had been validated at the highest levels of government. What happens next? Tomorrow, instead of appearing before the Administrative Review Board, you'll be meeting with the Independent Commission to provide your testimony and evidence. Your role will shift from complainant to key witness in a much larger investigation. Reynolds gathered her documents and prepared to leave. Captain, there's one more thing you should know. The Commission has already identified several other military personnel who were improperly passed over for Royal Guard positions. They'll all be given new consideration under reformed selection procedures. As Marcus walked back to his car, he reflected on how dramatically his situation had changed in just a few weeks. His simple desire to ensure fair treatment for qualified officers had evolved into a role as a key figure in cleaning up government corruption. The next morning brought news that would stun the entire palace administration. Director Ashford had been arrested on charges of corruption, bribery, and abuse of office. The Independent Commission had moved quickly to secure evidence and prevent any potential destruction of documents. Marcus realized that his individual act of conscience had connected with much larger forces committed to maintaining integrity in government institutions. The challenge he had initiated was about to transform the entire palace administration system. 6 weeks after Director Ashford's arrest, Marcus found himself walking through the same palace corridors where his journey had begun. But everything had changed. The marble floors gleamed as brightly as before, but the atmosphere was completely different. Staff members moved with renewed purpose, and there was an energy of reform and accountability that had replaced the previous air of secretive privilege. The Independent Commission had worked with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Their preliminary report documented a network of corruption that extended far beyond Royal Guard appointments to include catering contracts, security services, maintenance agreements, and even tour guide positions. More than 30 people had been implicated in various levels of misconduct. Marcus was scheduled to meet with Lady Catherine Morrison, the newly appointed Director of Palace Administration. Lady Morrison had been brought in from outside the palace system specifically to implement the reforms recommended by the Commission. Her reputation for absolute integrity and innovative management had made her the unanimous choice to clean up the administration. Captain Chen, Lady Morrison said as she greeted him in her office, the same office where Director Ashford had once tried to dismiss his concerns. I cannot adequately express how grateful the palace administration is for your courage in bringing these issues to light. The office had been completely redecorated. Gone were the heavy mahogany furniture and formal portraits that had suggested old-world privilege. In their place were modern, functional furnishings and displays showing organizational charts, policy flowcharts, and performance metrics that emphasized transparency and accountability. Thank you, Lady Morrison. I'm just glad that the system is being reformed to ensure fair treatment for all candidates. She gestured for him to sit at a small conference table where several other officials were already seated. Marcus recognized Colonel Reynolds, along with 2 members of the Independent Commission and a representative from the Royal Private Secretary's office. Captain, We wanted to meet with you today to discuss the implementation of the new Royal Guard selection process and to offer you an opportunity that I think you'll find interesting. Lady Morrison opened a folder containing the reformed selection criteria. The new system emphasized objective evaluation metrics, transparent scoring systems, and multiple independent reviewers to prevent any single person from controlling appointment decisions. The new process will be overseen by a joint military-civilian board with representatives from different branches of service, palace security, and independent monitors. Every selection decision will be documented and subject to review. Marcus examined the new procedures, noting how they addressed every concern he had raised about the previous system. Merit-based evaluation was now the clearly stated priority, with specific guidelines for weighting different qualifications and experience factors. "This looks comprehensive," Marcus said. "It should ensure that the most qualified candidates are selected regardless of their personal connections." Colonel Reynolds leaned forward. "Captain, the new system is excellent, but it needs the right person to manage its implementation. Someone with unquestionable integrity, deep understanding of military qualifications, and the courage to resist any attempts to compromise the process." Lady Morrison smiled. "Captain Chen, we would like you to consider accepting the position of Royal Guard Selection Coordinator. You would be responsible for overseeing all appointments, ensuring adherence to the new procedures, and serving as the primary liaison between military personnel and palace administration." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The position would represent a significant advancement in his career, but more importantly, it would give him the authority to ensure that the reforms he had fought for were actually implemented correctly. "Lady Morrison, I'm honored by this offer, but I want to make sure I understand the full scope of the responsibilities." One of the commission members spoke up. "Captain, the selection coordinator position carries significant authority. You would report directly to Lady Morrison and have the power to approve or reject any appointment recommendation. You would also be responsible for conducting annual reviews of the selection process to ensure it continues to operate fairly." The representative from the Royal Private Secretary's office added, "This position comes with the full support of the royal family. They specifically requested that someone with your background and integrity be given this responsibility." Marcus considered the offer carefully. Accepting would mean leaving his current military unit and taking on responsibilities that extended well beyond normal military duties. But it would also mean ensuring that his fight for fairness had lasting impact. What about Lieutenant Harrison and Sergeant Mills? Their appointments were based on the previous corrupted system. Lady Morrison had clearly anticipated this question. "All appointments made during the period under investigation are being reviewed. Harrison and Mills will have the opportunity to compete for their positions under the new criteria. If they truly deserve their roles, they'll earn them through merit. If not, they'll be reassigned to positions more appropriate to their qualifications." Colonel Reynolds added, "Captain, several of the qualified officers who were previously rejected have already been contacted about reapplying under the new system. Your actions have given them a second chance at positions they deserved all along." The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed implementation timelines, budget allocations, and oversight mechanisms. Marcus asked detailed questions about everything from appeals procedures to performance evaluation standards, ensuring that he fully understood what he would be taking on. As the meeting concluded, Lady Morrison made one final point. "Captain, I want you to know that this investigation and reform process has attracted attention at the highest levels of government. Your willingness to speak up has been noted." 1 year later, Marcus stood in the same marble courtyard where his journey had begun, but he was no longer the frustrated military officer who had first challenged the palace system. As the Royal Guard Selection Coordinator, he wore a specially designed uniform that reflected his unique position, bridging military service and palace administration. The morning was significant for multiple reasons. Today marked the anniversary of his first confrontation with the corrupted selection process, but more importantly, it was the day of the first Royal Guard graduation ceremony under the completely reformed system. 12 new Royal Guards stood at attention in perfectly aligned formation. Each had earned their position through the rigorous merit-based evaluation process that Marcus had helped design and implement. Among them was Colonel Patricia Thompson, whose reapplication had resulted in not just acceptance but selection as the senior Royal Guard officer. Also present was Lieutenant Bradley Harrison, who had surprised everyone by requesting to go through the new selection process to prove he deserved his position. Legitimately, after months of additional training and evaluation, he had earned his place through merit rather than family connections. Sergeant David Mills, however, had chosen to transfer to a different position, more suited to his actual qualifications. Lady Morrison approached Marcus as the ceremony preparations continued around them. "Captain Chen, I have some news that I think will interest you greatly." She handed him an official document bearing multiple seals and signatures. "The Independent Commission has completed its final report, and their recommendations have been approved at the highest levels of government. The reforms you initiated here are being implemented across all royal appointments, not just Royal Guard positions." Marcus read the document with growing amazement. The new merit-based selection procedures, transparency requirements, and oversight mechanisms were being extended to every position within the royal administration, from senior policy advisors to maintenance staff. "This means that the problems you identified were just the beginning," Lady Morrison continued. "Your courage to speak up has resulted in the most comprehensive reform of royal administration in over a century." The ceremony began with traditional pomp and pageantry, but Marcus noticed how different the atmosphere felt compared to previous years. There was an energy of genuine accomplishment and earned pride rather than the hollow formality that had characterized events under the old system. As each new Royal Guard received their ceremonial sword and took their oath of service, Marcus felt a profound sense of satisfaction. These officers had earned their positions through demonstrated competence, leadership ability, and commitment to service. Their families could be proud knowing that their sons and daughters had succeeded through merit rather than connections. The ceremony's highlight came when the Royal Private Secretary stepped forward to make an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to recognize Captain Marcus Chen, whose integrity and courage initiated the reforms that have strengthened our entire institution." Marcus was called forward to receive a special commendation for distinguished service to the Crown. As he walked across the courtyard, he thought about all the qualified officers who had been unfairly rejected under the old system, many of whom would now have opportunities they deserved. "Captain Chen," the Royal Private Secretary said as he presented the award, "your willingness to challenge an unjust system, despite significant personal risk, exemplifies the highest ideals of public service. The Crown recognizes that institutional integrity depends on individuals who have the courage to speak truth to power." The applause was genuine and sustained. Marcus recognized faces in the crowd. Some were people he had worked with during the investigation. Others were officers who had benefited from the reformed selection process, and many were palace staff members who had witnessed his original challenge and its remarkable outcome. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself surrounded by people wanting to congratulate him and share their own stories about how the reforms had affected their work. One young lieutenant approached with particular enthusiasm. "Sir, I wanted you to know that I'm applying for Royal Guard positions next year. A year ago I wouldn't have bothered because I knew the selection was based on connections I didn't have. Now I know I'll get a fair evaluation based on my qualifications." These individual conversations reminded Marcus why his challenge had been worthwhile. Beyond the institutional changes and policy reforms, real people were benefiting from a system that now operated with integrity and fairness. As the crowd began to disperse, Colonel Reynolds approached Marcus with a final piece of news. "Captain, there's something else you should know. The success of these reforms has attracted international attention. Several other countries are studying our new procedures as models for their own government personnel systems." Marcus smiled at the irony. His individual complaint about 2 questionable appointments had grown into a reform model that might influence government integrity efforts around the world. Walking home that evening, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with his simple decision to speak up about unfairness. He had discovered that individual actions, when motivated by genuine commitment to justice, could create changes far beyond anything he had imagined possible. The palace behind him now operated with transparency and accountability that ensured every person who served there had earned their position through merit. The Royal Guard continued to maintain the highest standards of security and ceremonial excellence, But now those standards were achieved through genuine competence rather than inherited privilege. Marcus Chen had challenged a corrupted system and watched it transform into something worthy of the institution it served. His name would be remembered not for seeking personal advancement, but for having the courage to demand that others be treated fairly. In the end, that legacy meant more to him than any position or award he could have received.